Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blaze podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to dive into this episode. So first, Nick and Stabby send their regrets. They really wanted to be here for this one. They're huge Lord of the Rings nerds. But Nick's mean boss called him and he's like, hey, you know that work thing, paychecks, you like those? Come in. And so...
Picky.
Yeah, now Stabby's doing the house stuff that he was supposed to do because, you know, weather and winter season and blah, blah, blah. Boring. But they're not here, so you're stuck with us. And they're going to have a whole lot of fun, and they're going to wish they were here.
Yes.
And with that, we're going to let our guests introduce themselves to our listeners and viewers at home. First, we have Miss Jana S Brown.
Wait, me? I'm starting? I never start. But I guess,
alphabet is a thing, and it likes you today.
Oh, amazing. I'm Jana S. Brown. I write under the pen name Jena Rey, and I write fantasy, science fiction, urban fantasy, all sorts of shades of stuff, and I'm just excited to be here today.
Yeah, freaking standing. Next, we have Mr. Jesse James Fain, outlaw author himself.
Hi, everybody. I am the outlaw author, Jesse James Fain. I write anything that I can squeeze a gunfight, a fist fight, or a sword fight into. I generally focus on martial or revenge tales and cool characters and concepts that I invent in my spare time. And big Lord of the Rings fan, happy to be here.
So do you prefer the revenge stories to be brutal or creative?
I think it's important to do both. I think brutality gets boring without creativity, and a revenge story isn't a revenge story if someone doesn't die horribly. Sometimes the person looking out for revenge, sometimes that person is the one that dies horribly.
Yeah.
Okay. I can appreciate that. Sometimes it gets a little same, so they got to mix it up a little bit, like trick them or something, lure them and let them get eaten by wild monsters. So you have plausible deniability. I don't know, just something. All right. Next we have Mr. Posthumus standing in for J.F. Posthumus.
Yes, I am not the cute redhead on the photos. I am her husband. I'm also her silent partner, and I do help her along with some stories, especially short stories. We do high fantasy, urban fantasy, getting ready to do some sci-fi this coming year, and just have a grand time doing it no matter what length story we're playing with. And I kind of introduced her to Tolkien because I was a mad fiend for it back in the 70s when it first really started hitting big.
And originally Jenny had volunteered to come on this episode. I understand you suckered her into looking after your kids so you could sit in for her. And
Actually, it wasn't that hard of a push because she has never said that I didn't have the superior knowledge of all things Tolkien. I've read all of them. I only read the Silmarillion once. But The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings I have read double-digit times, and I have very passionate arguments about the movies with her, without her, and anyone who gets them within earshot, unfortunately for them.
Where's the door?
We only have 1 hour for the episode. Just one.
Just 1 hour.
All right, so
she's doing my job tonight of playing video games for a 10-year-old to get him to settle in while I talk all things Tolkien, but I'm sure she'll pop in here and relieve everyone's vision of my face with her pretty face. So it'll all be good.
And we want to go slightly out of alphabetical order so we can do all 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon. And we've got your narrator, Miss Teri K. Jobe.
Hey, Teri K. Jobe again, narrator, baby author, and I'm just happy to be here because I didn't have a voice last week.
That's
really putting a crib in the narration.
Were you shaking your fist at the sky and yelling at the kids to get off your lawn?
No, I was actually thrusting my fist in furious happiness over the fact that she's my narrator. She is absolutely everything we love to have in audiobooks. I've been an audiobook freak since 1984, and I have very particular demands when it comes to narration for audiobooks. I'm actually a bit of a snob, and she won by sheer talent. And so every time we have an audiobook coming out, I actually cannot wait for Teri to perform it and for us to get a chance to listen to it, because it's never disappointing and she usually surprises us in the best ways.
I can only be as great as the words the author gives to me.
And last but
We do.
certainly not least, we have Miss Melissa McShane, the author of the Warhamster series. You know I did that one on purpose.
I did. That's never going away, is it? No,
No.
it's not.
No,
Okay.
Don't wait for it to go away. Be happy it's there.
No, I'm thrilled. I'm Melissa McShane. I write many different varieties of fantasy, including contemporary fantasy, historical fantasy, and secondary world fantasy. J.R.R. refers to the Warhamster series as actually the War Master Lit RPG series, but early on, he made the mistake, and now it's canon. And at some point, I will have to write a war hamster into my series, or let him do it. Yeah, I love Tolkien. Like Mr. Posthumus, I've been reading since very young, and I have no memory of the first time I read it. So I guess that's something.
All right, but this is an important question, Melissa. Would the Warhamster do it for the Emperor, or does he reign for chaos?
I think he reigns for chaos. I think a hamster by nature, is a chaotic being. We just don't know it because they're cute and furry, but truly, they wish for chaos in this world, and they will get it eventually. You should be careful.
Okay. All right. So the next part of this introduction, dear listeners, how we all met. So we actually met in a group. We were hunting for the best place to have the 11sies. We went all over the Shire. Unfortunately, none of them met our high standards. So we just drafted Jana into cooking for us. She did make us clean the dishes and carry the pot, though. So
Well, if you don't have to clean. That is the rule.
Yeah.
Someone forgot to tell me that rule. I cook and clean. Man, I'm being cheated. I need to talk to my union man.
Yep.
That's the only reason I learned how to cook, was so I didn't have to do dishes.
Get a better rep.
All right, and now this is the part where we would normally do the religion questions, but all of our guests have been on this show many times, and rather than find movies to pick, from, or books or whatever that would be similar to the topic, which in this case is the Lord of the Rings franchise, I realized anything we could pick would be pale imitations of the original awesomeness. So instead, I'm going to ask, and everybody but Melissa, because she already answered, when you first became aware of like Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. We'll start with you, JF, Posthumus, Sir, Mister.
Absolutely. I was an 8-year-old kid, and the wonderful classic Hobbit cartoon came on cable television in 1977. And I was instantly hooked. I was actually hooked so bad that my parents found me the 33 RPM vinyl record made from the TV show recordings. It was basically an audiobook of sorts, except it was just a flat out recording from the. Yeah. There was no narration of he walks along and finds the evil Smaug. Nothing like that. It was just straight out recording from the movie. And I used to listen to that for hours. And I talked to one of my cousins who turned out to be already into Dungeons and Dragons. He had jumped on it when it was way early. And he was a huge Tolkien fiend. So he's like, let me get you the book. Hands me the book. And then after that, he's like, all right, here's the first book in the trilogy. Here's the second book in the trilogy. And then I fractured my skull when I was 10. And he came to visit me in the hospital and brought me the last book, Return of the King. So that was his wake up, get better present. Was that and a bunch of shrinky dinks he had made of the original Lord of the Rings cartoon movie characters.
Nice.
And I had basically, you can call it brain damage since I, cracked my skull, but I just drank all that stuff in, and it just became my go-to for everything. It was my comparison for everything. Even, Star Trek, I was a Trekkie before that. But everything since then, it's either, okay, does it measure up to these two? If it's fantasy, does it measure up to Tolkien? If it's sci-fi, does it measure up to Trek? And I've never really lost that.
Yeah, I think for me, it was the Hobbit cartoon as well, in the weird cartoon style that was popular back then. That's how I first found it. And then I wanted more. And so I asked the I think it was elementary school. I asked the librarian, and she just set the book down, and she's like, "Start here," and that was the end of it for me. All right, what about you, Teri? How did you first find the awesomeness that is Mr. Tolkien?
So when I was about 3 years old, I have a distinct memory of my dad had this like recliner chair that I would crawl up on the back of, which really wasn't safe, but who cared? And I would just lay there on top of that chair and look over his shoulder as he read The Hobbit to me. Then a few years later, he introduced me to the BBC radio productions of both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So those are like my standards for fantasy, as Posthumus said here a minute ago, and also for narration and just audio performance. Those are some of my. If I'm hitting that mark, I'm doing okay.
That's a high bar. So
I just realized
it is.
Everybody but Jesse here is old enough to remember when we used to call them, instead of audiobooks, we called them books on tape. I still do that sometimes, and people look at me funny, and I'm like, oh, audiobooks.
Dude, just don't say books on tape. What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
I may have been single digits, but I do remember books on tape.
Okay. You can join the club.
I had a Walkman and a couple extra empty cassette tape cases that I just put in my pockets, and like I'm good for like 3 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they always said that they were anti-skip, the Walkman and the CD man. They lied.
Yeah, they did.
They tried.
It was a valiant effort, but yeah.
So a lot of that clothing from the 80s and 90s is coming back. So I'm hoping the mullet and the Walkman might make a show again.
Oh, good.
There was a kid across the way from us at the craft booth we were selling at a couple of weeks ago, and he had a mullet. Little kid, he was maybe 2, cute as could be, had a mullet.
I had a mullet in an elementary school because I wanted to be cool, but also because the rat tails that were popular. My mom wouldn't let me get one of those because those just looked So I had the mullet instead because that's so much classier.
Oh yeah, totally.
Oh, just to make sure no one thinks I'm wearing one.
Okay. Good. Thank you for clarifying that.
Thanks.
The problem. They're sitting there going, I better say something. Oh Lord.
So Jesse, when did you first discover Tolkien?
So about 8, I tell a longer version of this story on my Substack. About 8, my grandfather handed me a huge box. I mean, massive, like think lamp box full of books. And there was Dune was in there, David Eddings, the Belgariad, and the what's the other one? The Millennium, Robin Hobb, all kinds of classic science fiction and fantasy. The box was just full of them. And so it took me probably, 4 or 5 years to get through the whole box because my parents would buy me books and I got into D&D and, other stuff was going on. I started playing sports and things took time. So it probably wasn't until around 10 that I pulled out the Fellowship of the Ring. And I started reading. So I'm kind of backwards in my experience than what a lot of people would tell you. I read the whole trilogy first, then read The Hobbit later. But I read the Fellowship at 10, the Two Towers about 12, and finished the Fellowship of the Ring, or not the Fellowship, the Return of the King in high school, just starting high school. So that was my experience.
And last but certainly not least, Miss Jana.
Let's see. So earliest was the cartoon. And I wasn't very old. I was 5 or 6, I think. And we only watched part of it because my little sister came into the room and the Gollum animation scared the living daylights out of her. And so she went shrieking up the stairs and my parents came and shut it off because we had obviously stumbled onto something terrifying. But it stuck with me. And that's the first thing. But the first time that I read the books was when my father, who is a non-reader, my dad reads magazine articles. He does a lot of work with lathes and this, that, and the other. He's just a construction guy, good with his hands. And so he reads lots of instructional books, but reading fiction was never his thing. And the one book that he ever bought for me was The Hobbit when I was about 8, because it had a shiny gold cover with a picture of the eagles and Gandalf and the little hobbit on the front. And he says, "This is your kind of thing. I read it once a long time ago, and that is the only book he has ever given to me." And so that was my very first time reading The Hobbit, was after my dad handed me that book.
Yeah, my dad is more likely to read Chilton auto manuals than he was a novel. So I feel
Exactly.
I don't even know if they make those anymore. That'd be something to look up. Anyway, all right. And so now you have a choice. We're going to go back to you since you were already just talking, Jana. The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, or The Silmarillion?
See, that one's really hard because it's different. It's such different flavors, and I like them for different things. The one I've read the most is The Hobbit. That's the one that I come back to. But the other two are both favorites. So The Hobbit, but it's only edging it out by a tiny bit.
Okay. All right, Teri.
Ooh, I think I'm going to have to say The Hobbit as well, just because that was the first one I was introduced to. It's a little bit more, it's not quite as dense as The Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion, so it's a little easier to get into, and it's just fun.
Okay. What about you, Jesse?
So I'm going to go with The Lord of the Rings. I happen to be reading the series right in a time where you're really learning how to be a man. Right when the testosterone's puberty's kicked in, and my father was sick. He had MS, and so I became the man of the house at a very young age, having to move all the furniture, take care of physical stuff. I became the protector early. That's a lot of the reason for my boxing lessons and things like that. All the stuff that I write now is because of that, because that was very important to me to be able to carry Dad's flag. And so Aragorn and Faramir and Boromir, both from a movie and a book perspective, both versions of all those characters, because I'm a 90s kid, so the movies were coming out at that same time, that same age.
Yeah.
Were very instrumental in me discovering the man I wanted to be. And that was a big influence there. So the Two Towers I read probably every couple of years, just because that is, of all the Tolkien, that's the book that sticks with me the most. Theoden. So.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good answer. Very, very, mature sounding. That's not like us, but we'll take it. All right. Posthumus. When did you, which would it be for you? The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, or The Silmarillion?
If it's for me personally, I would say Lord of the Rings. If it's I want to introduce someone to the idea of Middle Earth or just fantasy in general, I actually would say The Hobbit, because The Hobbit engrosses a lot of what Middle Earth is, and it's a much more digestible for a newbie to take on. But for me, even though The Hobbit was my first experience, and that cartoon still holds like the biggest part of my heart and geekdom, the Fellowship of the Ring was always the big book for me. I read The Two Towers and I read Return of the King so I could finish out the series. I read that other one because my mouth doesn't want to work tonight. I read that one because I wanted to get through all the stuff and have as much of a complete picture as I could in my head. But Fellowship was the one for me because that one, I don't know, I guess it was just because it hit me at the right time and because I felt more in tune with the hobbits in that one. By the time they got into Two Towers and Return of the King, it was really more about the entire cast of characters. And hobbits had gone through a lot. They weren't like kids. So I kind of felt outside of them. But during the Fellowship of the Ring, I felt very much like I could be a hobbit. But yeah, if you want to introduce the the whole thing to people in general, I would say The Hobbit is the best way to go, simply because, as I said, much easier for people to digest. If they can't handle more than what The Hobbit gives, then you certainly don't want them to read either the Silmarillion or the Lord of the Rings. But that one's, it's watered down just enough. Not much, but just enough to where it's a little easier to get through.
So I would pick The Hobbit because that's just one I found first. And so every time I reread it, you're trying to recapture that initial awe as you read it the first time. You never really can quite, but I do find every time I reread that one, or books in general, you always find something else that you missed the first time, or at least when they're well written. You've got layers upon layers to dig through. So I still enjoy it. What about you, Melissa?
Okay, I'm going to be that one and say the Silmarillion, because even though I've only read it a couple of times and it's been a long time, the way it's structured means that you can dip into it at any point and get something new out of the world of the Lord of the Rings, out of Middle-earth. And I was that kid who learned to write Dwarven runes and Elvish script, and I still found there are places in my books where there are notes that I wrote to my soon-to-be husband back in college that are in Elvish script, so that, because we just thought that was cool. Yep.
That's awesome.
Yep, I was that kid. So so the Silmarillion, and it makes I think because I love the Lord of the Rings so much, it gave depth to what I was reading, and the idea that there was something bigger and badder than Sauron scared the crap out of me. I mean, Sauron is awful, but Morgoth and the different people who come before him, they're terrifying. And that Tolkien had all of this in his head and was just sort of tossing it out. I mean, the guy was a genius. So the Silmarillion to me kind of gives shape to the Lord of the Rings. So even though I don't know that I would go back to it, I certainly would not read it cover to cover. I think that's either a little too much or maybe not really what the intent was. So it's really not the same reading experience, but it gave shape to what I was reading in the Lord of the Rings.
Okay. All right. And this is another question we stole from the creative mind of Jesse James Fain. So would you rather have dinner with the hobbits, drinks with the dwarves, or share a pipe with the wizards? We'll go to you, Mr. Posthumus.
Oh, dinner with the hobbits. I mean, I'm a chef, so to me, it's all about the meal, the presentation, the camaraderie. And if someone else cleans up the plates, great. But no, I'm totally going to be going to the hobbits and going, okay, what are we having?
So breakfast, second breakfast, 11sies, lunch or dinner?
Yes.
You forgot
Always the right
supper.
answer.
Oh, yeah.
All right, Jesse, since it's your question, we'll go to you next.
I'm going to go drinks with the dwarves. I just think that that's going to be an absolutely uproarious time. And I'm not a heavy drinker, so, I'm just going to have to pretend like I'm keeping up, maybe throw something over my shoulder. But that's going to be, especially if it's anything as portrayed in the movie, where suddenly the song and dance kicks out at some point. That's going to be a rowdy time I want to be there for.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the dwarves, too, because that feels like every barracks drink-off I've ever been a part of. That sounds like it would be that all over again, but they're shorter, so I could do the tall
and
ones.
more stout, so they can actually handle
Stouter, they
the
can take it.
Yeah, and so at 5'9", I'm like the runt of the litter. A lot of my uncles and stuff are all like over 6 foot. So it'd be nice to be the tall guy for a little bit.
Yeah, but they drink you under the table. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not, because I'll probably pass out on the table because it's a smaller table.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, you got style. You're good to go.
Right. Yeah. All right. What about you, Jana? Do I need to repeat the question?
I'm with the hobbits all the way. I made 5 pounds of fudge today just because I could. And tomorrow I'm making about 6 dozen sugar cookies, some of which are going to Melissa's daughter so she can take them to work because I am a sucker. And then I made apple cake and amber sauce. And I also have to make cheese balls. So especially during December, it's baking and making cool things every single day. So the hobbits can come into my house and we're good.
I'll send you my address, Jana. So
Right.
you can
Jana wasn't into
we are recording this.
into anything. She
And-
decided she was going to go, and somebody just knew what to ask her. That's what happened.
Mhm.
So full
gonna
disclosure, we're recording this the first week of December. And Jen, I want you to know for the Thanksgiving shindig I did a green bean casserole and sweet potato casserole, and nobody died.
Woo!
That's like
Progress.
that's starting points right there. All right, Teri, are you gonna have drinks with the dwarves, eat with the hobbits, or smoke a pipe with the wizards?
I'm breaking the mold here. I'm gonna go smoke with the wizards.
All right, so this is the important question. What is in that pipe? Is it the wacky tobacco, the devil's lettuce, or just, the normal stuff?
Well, wouldn't you like to know? No, it's actually really close. It'd be either that or the hobbits, but I think just that idea of having a deep camaraderie conversation about all these deeper topics of the world, I might enjoy that. I think.
That was
she's
like
gonna have the halfling leaf, whatever that actually happens to be.
Yeah.
Big
Mhm.
leaf,
Old
Gansy.
Toby.
Old
And-
Toby, they'd like that. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Mhm.
I can appreciate that. All right, last but certainly not least, Melissa.
Well, I am not a cook. I live here in India, and I can afford to eat out every night if I wish. And so I would go with the hobbits because they know how to throw a party and they know how to cook. And I am fond of eating. So
Excellent answer. All right, so next we're going to ask, because I had more questions, but we've had a lot of fun, so I'm going to pare it down a little bit. So before we move on to the franchise itself, would you live in the Lord of the Rings world if you could? Mr. Posthumous.
Yeah. I mean, dude, that was my childhood. That was the reason I played D&D from the age of 8 until still playing. Okay. I still make stuff for D&D. When I get the time, I'm going to finish writing I'm going to basically edit the trilogy that I wrote about my favorite D&D campaigns. And they'll be under JF Posthumous, but Jen likes to say that the sci-fi world is her world. Absolutely right. That's her universe. But anything fantasy, that's my realm. And that's very true because I brought her in. I taught her D&D. I insisted she sit down and watch the Hobbit cartoon. I never made her go through the 81 Bluth one, but that's because by then you already had you had Jackson's stuff coming. So there wasn't any reason to do that. I did make her watch the cartoon Return of the King sequel.
oh my gosh, no.
Oh, yes. No. If I have to suffer that, she can suffer through that too. In my childhood, so she had to know the pain as well as the pleasure. But
that was awful.
no, I absolutely would have. I have populated whole cities and countries with NPCs that are basically me in different aspects, or people I've known. I've written any person I have ever met and has made even a minor impact in my brain somewhere populates the world where I do D&D and consequently where we write our high fantasy stuff. So no, I would be totally there, probably be doing a tavern with blacksmithing out back for fun when it gets cold.
Okay. What about you, Jesse?
So very similar. I was born to be a blacksmith. I'm a nearsighted powerlifting, specifically bench press champion that understands science fairly well. So yeah, I would be an artificer, absolutely, given the opportunity. I would be trying to make sure that everybody had a magic sword out there in the back in the smithy, hammering away all day and most of the night too. So yeah, I'd take that opportunity.
So being a smith is actually probably one of the safest jobs in the world for all it's inherently dangerous to be a smith. But think about it. Every time they raided the village, we'll use the Viking example, who didn't they kill? The guy that could make more weapons. Like, you're the brewer and you're the or you're the blacksmith. Your chances of living are a lot higher than if you're just random Joe Farmer.
Yeah. You can make something they want, they'll keep you around.
Right? They don't kill you right away, and that gives you time to plot your revenge, right, Jesse? Right? Revenge.
Absolutely.
All right, Jana, if you could, would you live there?
See, I think it's harder than that because I would live in the Shire. The whole idea of, and in the hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, and that means comfort. That kind of place, I would live there. But a lot of the other, I'm a fan of my creature comforts. I have bad hips and bad knees, and so some of the stuff where it's like walk for days and days to get to my nearest relative's house. No. Ride horses, can't do that anymore. No heart medication. So now I need magic so I didn't die. So the practical part of me says no. The part of me that grew up living this goes, oh yeah. So there you go.
Mhm.
Practicality versus the actual fantasy of it.
Well, I mean, if you go and become an elf there, you could practically live forever.
Mm.
So you just don't be a human.
Again, which side is it? How fantastical are we allowed to get?
Absolutely, as much as you want. All right, Teri, you living in the Shire or with the elves or the dwarves? You moving there?
I probably would, and I don't know if I'd live in the Shire, but maybe Rivendell or Lothlorien, somewhere with trees. I'm biased at the moment. I'm on the plains of Colorado. There's no trees. I want trees. Take me to Rivendell, please.
All right, so trees are noted.
Well, not to mention, her husband looks like a freaking half elf. So
yeah, that's fair.
It kind of shows in her personality.
Or one of the Rohirrim. I could see him being one of the Rohirrim.
That's the thing. He could be a half elf and a Rohirrim.
That's true.
That would have fit.
True. Good point.
That would have fit. So, but yeah, I could totally see him doing the same thing.
All right, what about you, Melissa? You moving there?
Well, if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have said yes, but I like indoor plumbing, and there is no evidence of that anywhere in Middle-earth. So I'm going to say if I could be an elf, because elves look to me, Tolkien elves look to me like they have their bodily functions handled. And so I'd say, yeah, if I could be an elf, yeah, sure, I'd like to live in Middle-earth. But in general, no. Maybe my answer would be different if I were a plumber or an engineer or something who could invent plumbing for Middle-earth. I've thought that would be a fun thing to do, but yeah, I'm going to go with no on that.
I would say yes, but I'd want to be a dwarf because they could live to be like 250, 300. Elves are cool, but I think elves, generally speaking, are kind of jerks, and I like the dwarves. Like, they're like every vet bro I've ever met. Like, we're going to be drinking. I mean, it's almost like living in Valhalla to live with them, right? Like, how cool is that? So I'm totally going if I could be a dwarf and live under the mountain with them. Although I want to caveat, I don't want the version of all of this where the female dwarves have beards. That's just not my thing. I'm just going to throw that out there. We got to set some standards. All right.
Fair.
I don't know if that was actually in Tolkien or if that was a D&D thing later. But
no, that was actually in Tolkien.
It's Terry Pratchett too.
There. Yeah.
Well, we just got to undo that one slight, tiny, itsy bitsy piece of canon, and I'm good.
That was actually in Tolkien, and they took it out for Gary Gygax. Didn't like that either, so that's why it was taken out for D&D. You could have it either as with a beard or not with a beard.
But if you read Terry Pratchett, he's got it back in there. So
yes, he does.
Depending on and it's fantastic. But yeah, so you pick your version, and you can have a version with dwarves, women with no beards.
There you go. I've got to have standards, right? All right. So this is the part where I remind you that we are all civilized human beings here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. We are no longer knuckle-dragging troglodytes. So coffee or tea, and how would Gandalf take it? Melissa.
Well, it's neither coffee nor tea for me. Right now, it is sparkling lemon ginger water, which is fantastic. But I think Gandalf is a busy guy, and he doesn't have time for frilly drinks, so I think he takes it black. That's what I think.
Okay. Teri?
I think Gandalf would probably have tea, but I think Radagast the Brown would definitely be a coffee drinker. Multiple cups a day.
Uh-huh.
He's the guy that pours that takes the pot and he pours a cup and then he puts the cup back for other people and then drinks out of the pot.
Yes, that's Radagast.
All right, Jana.
I think Gandalf's a tea drinker, and actually during the winter time, so am I. I drink a blueberry passion fruit tea. because you just want to be all warmed up. And there's the wonderful thing about tea is there's a certain sense of ceremony about it, and you see that in lots of different cultures. And I think Gandalf would appreciate that level that goes there, especially depending on where he is. Rivendell, for example, strikes me as a tea kind of place where you would have that ceremony, that slowness to it, all those things that you do. So I think Gandalf is adjustable enough that it would also depend on where he is and who he's drinking with.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Jesse.
Well, so I'm a hot chocolate person. We've addressed that multiple times. I think for Gandalf, I think Jana really hit the nail on the head there. I think that it all depends. Gandalf shows a lot of adaptability. He's a world traveler. He's very wizened in all his years. And you see what I did there with wizened? Anyway.
I did. I'm tracking. I'm picking up what you put down.
So I think that it would absolutely depend on what the highest quality would be available where he was. On the road, sure, boil it up, throw it back down. But if we're somewhere nice, I'm sure the hobbits have really nice coffee. They have really nice everything else. Why wouldn't they? So that, just depends on where you're at.
Okay. Posthumus?
I guess the whole bottom row is in agreement here that Gandalf would kind of go with what's being served. Now, I think that it would depend on, we could argue and have some fun with the idea of Gandalf the Grey is more of a coffee drinker and Gandalf the White is the tea drinker.
Oh, there we go.
No, I like that.
But
sure.
For me, I always pictured Gandalf as being more of a, wherever he was, he would drink the norm. Personally, I would think he would be more of a, if you gave him the option, if he were at the Hobbits, I definitely think he would have coffee. But there's also the part of the halfling leaf, which he was so fond of. If he's having a pipe, I would, from personal experience, would say that coffee goes a lot better than just about any kind of tea, if that kind of thing. But as for, again, I think it's really a matter of what he feels like if he's not in someone's company. It'd be like, okay, do I feel like I want tea or do I want coffee? And he would just have whichever it was straight across the board because he doesn't know whether there's going to be sugar, whether there's going to be cream, whether there's going to be anything, let alone salt. Yes, you can put salt in coffee and tea. It actually takes away the bitterness.
I know people put butter in their coffee, which just sounds weird to me.
It's a fat. I mean, if you're putting dairy in your coffee, you're basically putting a creamy fat in there to cut the acidic levels. And that breaks down the bitterness. But again, you can throw salt in there, but the fat is there to break up the acid. So that's really the reason that it feels so good on the palate and why it's better. I can drink black coffee and I like black coffee as long as it's not too strong a brew, but there comes to a point where my stomach is like, if you drink more of this crap, I am going to make you stay in the bathroom all day. So I'll add a little bit of cream at that point to break up the acidity. And I've noticed that kind of goes with people like first responders. When they're young and brash and their bodies are still pretty healthy, they'll oh yeah, I'm going to have it black. It's never. You get them older, there's more dairy. And there's more, non-fat stuff and more sugar-free stuff if they're having problems with that. But the older you get, the more you want that extra flavor. But again, Gandalf I see is just, he goes with the flow and he just goes with what he feels like when he's on his own.
Okay. See, I'm going to mix it up from all of you. So anybody that can hang with the dwarves has a little bit of a cast iron stomach. So I'm thinking he's the guy that's putting a little bit of the fire water into his coffee or just drinking the fire water straight. But, since it's coffee or tea question, I'm thinking he's the one drinking the spiked coffee, maybe a little bourbon, maybe a little peppermint schnapps. I don't know, but he's definitely throwing mulled wine on. He's mixing the booze in there. And he's got to deal with the hobbits. And they always frustrate him. So I'm thinking he needs something to take the edge off so he doesn't turn him into ash or something.
Well, can you imagine dwarves being tea drinkers? I mean, no offense to anybody who drinks tea, but
no, dwarves are going to be drinking coffee.
They're pretty about this stuff. So they're black coffee drinkers and probably the stronger the drinker.
Yeah, so the other question is, are we talking Gandalf before the Balrog or after? Because I get the impression he got a little salty afterwards.
Like I said, I've already said my joke for that one, so I'll leave it to everybody else.
All right, well, now we're going to dive into the actual topic that brought us here. But first, we're going to shamelessly shill for the woman today. Boom!
All right.
The necromantic magic of the Great Lich has held sway over the world for 100 years. Can a young knight of the god of death and the last priestess of the goddess of life destroy him before their homeland falls? The only survivor of his convoy, journeyman knight Darian, is entrusted with an ancient scroll and one mission. Return the scroll to the High Temple in Hothan, no matter the cost. He never expected that journey to include stumbling onto the last healer in the world. Now he must take not only the scroll but the woman across the kingdom to safety, each step dogged by the relentless undead. Death's Knight, Book 1 in the completed War of the Lich series by Matthew T. Summers and Jena Rey.
All right. Thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. And with that, we're going to go back to talking about Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings franchise. So first, we've talked about, a little bit of the lore and why it appealed to us as fans and the getting to know you kind of portion. So what do you think makes, people have been writing fantasy even before Tolkien. What do you think about the Lord of the Rings franchise? So that includes all of the properties therein. Makes it so timeless that we keep coming back for it. I mean, I've seen modern writers complain that Tolkien's still on the bestseller list and they can't break the top 100. Why is that, do you think?
Tough rocks, guys. Well, okay, speaking of earlier fantasies, Tolkien's contemporaries were not doing the same thing he was. I mean, he was telling stories. A lot of them were writing literary fiction or the equivalent of it. And I think that does not age well because it depends on the time in which it's written. And Tolkien didn't do that. He was writing a story and he didn't care whether the story made him money. He didn't care whether the story was a thing for the ages. He was just telling tales. And
the world, though, I mean, that was like you were saying, Melissa. Most everybody else was doing like little stories or takes on fairy tale kind of stuff. He built an entire world. It was all in his head. He made Elvish. Now, granted, he was an English teacher and had a lot of language skills, so that was easy for him. But he built a world. It was one of those fully immersible things, and as you said, that was not the norm.
No,
that's really
no. And speaking of, him being, I mean, that's part of what gives it life is that he built this world and it's something that all of us can be part of, that it wasn't exclusive. It was something that gave it, life, that you can go in there and say, well, I can imagine myself being an elf in Rivendell. I can imagine myself drinking with the dwarves. Yeah. I can tell stories in this world just the way he did. And I think that's part of the draw. It's like you're saying, he created a whole world. Well, that world is for everyone.
Exactly. It's fully immersible for anyone to be a part of or to let themselves into. And on top of that, it's open enough to where you can bring your own thing to it. So it's personalized in addition to having a general draw and knowledge for a larger audience. And that, I mean, what are most of the IPs these days and for the past 10, 15 years been trying to do? They've been trying to build fully immersible universes. Tolkien really put that on the map for literature and fiction in many ways.
Well, one of the reasons he did is he had the benefit because, it's kind of known out there that Tolkien was writing for two things. He wanted modern mythology and lore for England. He felt like they were losing their culture, and he wanted to tell stories to his kids. This started out him entertaining his young children. And anybody that's had young children knows they ask why a lot. And part of the Socratic method is, asking, if you ask why enough times, you drill down to the root of the thing, which is what you have to do to understand it. So I think the fact and the function of telling those stories to his kids and dealing with all those annoying questions, God bless him, it what made the world richer because he had to come up with answers to things you might not have thought of on your own.
Oh yeah, he had to be challenged. He was challenged by his audience to come up with answers because you can't be the adult with no answers to the kids.
Yeah.
Well, and not only that, But it's so I'm a firm believer in what you put in. And what you put in is what you get out of something, right? And I'm not saying that as authors and narrators and everything, we don't put things into our work. But Tolkien puts his life into this work and his love into this work. He puts his experiences with one of the most nightmarish battles of the century. He puts the love of his wife, the love of his children. He puts everything that is him, and he's meeting and speaking with great contemporary scholars that we would now later on, like dudes like C.S. Lewis, that we would later on venerate for their mythos, for their C.S. Lewis writings on Christianity and things like that are widely regarded and studied in college. I took classes on it. And so this man puts his all into doing something that, at least on a widespread basis, nobody else knew had been done before. You put your whole life and love into something, that's how it comes out. And it's very hard to rival someone who's that dedicated.
Well, and he also really embraced, it's one of these great mythologies that embraces the every man as the point of view character. That it's not Aragorn, son of Arathorn, that the whole thing is about, even though he's the one that becomes the king. Spoiler alert, for those who haven't read it, Aragorn becomes the king in the end. There's all these people that, the ones who have the great power, the great abilities, all that kind of stuff, they're there, but that's not who the story is about. It's about the guys from the Shire who really and truly just want second breakfast, who have to grow up, who have to go through these big changes. And even when those changes are done, what do they want more than anything? It's that whole thing about if more of us valued those things that you do, home and hearth and food and sharing it with people over gold and over all these things, it would be a merrier world. And that's a story that we want to hear, I think, because we do see in every generation, we see how bad it can be. We see people going to war over things that are really stupid in the long run. And what is it that you fight for? It all comes back to home and family and hearth. And so those were our point of view characters that we went through these journeys with, were the people who were just like us.
Mm-hmm.
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 I also think, that his one of the things I liked about him, which is why, I went to the military thing in college. And one of the things I liked about him was his combat experience led him to create this as sort of art therapy, essentially. Yep. I mean, he was at some of the bloodiest battles of World War I. He was a grunt as well. He was in one of the Fusilier regiments. I'm pretty sure it's the Lancashire, but I know he was a Fusilier because there's an infantry unit. And the Brits get all weird with their unit names, so it could be. I'm sorry if you're British and you're listening, but it's true. So he was at some of the huge, like one of the hugest battles in World War I was the Somme. And I mean, that shaped culture. Generations of, a whole generation of men died today. And so, having seen the darkness, I think you can see some of that in what he writes because, the concept of good versus evil was really murky in World War I. I mean, the other guy weren't necessarily bad. They were just doing the same thing you were for the other side. And so by writing the way he did, he revisited the concept of the good is the good and the bad is the bad. And I actually kind of like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there are a couple of really good autobiographies, or not autobiographies, just biographies in general about him that are really worth reading. Some of them focus specifically on his time in the Great War. So,
yeah, he was my biography subject when I was in like 7th grade, I think. And that's been way too long since I was in 7th grade. But it was fascinating to read just how much of his life made it into the Lord of the Rings for whatever reason. I like to think he was working out his demons, honestly. But he also saw, like you're saying, he saw the brightness afterward. I think that made him appreciate the good parts of life as well.
Well, kind of a counterpoint to that, I think he also understood and put into his works, the Return of the King especially, that war touches everywhere. It doesn't matter if it's, on some battlefront far away, it still comes into your homes, even if you're far removed from it. I mean, Return of the King, it did come to the Shire, spoilers, but not to the grandiose scale that it did in Rohan or Gondor. It was still there, and it still affected everyone, even if they weren't involved in those bigger battles.
Yeah.
It's that very human aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it emphasizes the power of individual choices, that an individual warrior on a field can make a difference, that an individual person who says, I'm going to take on this thing, makes a difference. And we all want to believe that, because it's really easy to get lost in the morass of humanity and to say nothing that I do matters. And these stories tell you that the actions and the choices of individuals matter. The compassion of individuals matter. Because in the end, Frodo didn't win. Frodo did not overcome the ring, but his compassion, the compassion of Bilbo in letting Gollum live and continuing to let Gollum do his thing and almost be redeemed at one point, that's the thing that saves the day. It's not what anybody else does. It's the compassion let somebody live who by all rights they should have killed.
Mm-hmm.
I will say one of the things that when you talk about his compassion, one of the things that strikes me is we sometimes don't quite grasp what that generation and the one that came after went through. Like nowadays with the global war on terror, and we all sort of for the last 20-something years, we remember all of that. And it's odd for most people, they'll never know someone who served because it's such a small fractional percentage that actually does that. Whereas the exact opposite was true. It was rarer to know someone who didn't serve in World War I and World War II. And so that whole militarism, it was just baked into the everyday culture for them. And so I think some of this is not just for him, but for his contemporaries. This was sort of their way of recapturing some of what they sacrificed in the war, that youthful innocence, where the world really was just good or bad. Because I think it's really easy to become jaded afterwards. And so for me, this is one man reclaiming that for himself in his writing.
Yeah.
No, and the camaraderie shows in so many of the characters, especially in our small characters, in the Hobbits. I was cracking a joke in the side chat, like Sam stacking orcs with a frying pan to save his best friend. Like it doesn't get better than that from a camaraderie perspective. The Hobbits, the way they have to rally, they have to tackle things that they never thought they would have to do. Violence is inherent for the Gimlis and the Legolas and even Aragorn outcast as Strider. They're all, this is all something that they do. It's all built in for them. But the poor hobbits are your wide-eyed boots that just got drafted into the war. And they have to deal with something far beyond what they ever thought they would be able to handle. And especially, like Sam's one of my heroes. So especially with Sam, but all of the hobbits tackle that in their own way, either through loyalty or humor or just dealing with it the way survivors deal with it. But you get that. I mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier, talking about the different loves and the four loves, and you get that camaraderie love very heavily. You get the masculine love for a brother extremely heavy in this series.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I think the Scouring of the Shire is so important and so popular, because that's really, they made the movies and I know a lot of people who loved the books are like, why did they have to leave that out? Even the ones who knew why they had to leave it out because, thematically and narratively it didn't fit. We're still going, we love this. It works for us. This is satisfying because it's the end of the Hobbit's journey. And it makes them, it made the whole thing come full circle, I think.
It also showed their growth.
Yeah.
And one of the things is everybody who wants to be new age and edgy and postmodernist, whatever, about writing that's older than they are. One of the things they want to call is everybody's racist and sexist, but like they never credit some of his creativity. Like he had, I'm going to butcher her pronunciation, Eowyn. Yeah. Like they had the monster that couldn't be killed by mortal man or by man. So he had a woman killer or kill it.
Yeah.
In that age, like the idea that women could be badass on the battlefield wasn't like that. It wasn't like you had Xena on TV growing up, right? No. That was groundbreaking at the time.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And yet Eowyn was still a woman. I mean, she wasn't like a fake man. She was a woman. She ended up with, her love, and she ended up being this home and hearth keeper, but she could do both. He's saying there's nothing that says if you are female, if you are taking care of a home, if you are taking care of children, that's not everything you are. And giving her that ability, that moment, I think was powerful for me as a young female reader, because I loved the Lord of the Rings. I never felt excluded on the basis that there are all these men and there are very few women, but Eowyn still was something her journey really moved me for that reason, because she could be badass and she could be a woman.
And rumor has it that Sam gifted her that frying pan for her wedding gift. So her husband never stepped out of line.
That's right. You got to watch it there. You know what she can do.
Galadriel ruled the elves. I mean, Elrond, if you just go with The Hobbit, you think Elrond's the king of the elves. I mean, it's really her.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, he highlights that in Fellowship of the Ring, where she's like, no, you can't put this on me. I will become worse than Sauron.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is when women are supposed to be at home being, barefoot, pregnant, all the old cliches. But she's the one who rules the roost, and she knows that if she is given the opportunity to wield that much power, she will be horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And she doesn't shy away from that fact. She embraces it and says, nope, I can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I will be more terrible than the night. And
yeah,
the hobbits are kids, comparatively speaking, to all the other races, and they make them matter. They show that they can grow, they can adapt. So it's really all about the adaptability of anyone if they're put into the situation and they choose to not give up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Galadriel arguably shows some of the highest level of wisdom in the series.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
At least as far as the Lord of the Rings is concerned. She recognizes what she can and cannot do and what her limits are. Not all of the Fellowship does that. Looking at you, Boromir.
Don't know what you mean.
No, but I always felt sorry for Boromir because he was in a terrible position.
Oh yeah,
there was so much writing on him, and there were so many people that were looking to him to say, "Okay, you're going to rise up, and you've been leading us, and you've been doing this." Gondor was in a terrible position for a long time, and they held off the forces of the orcs and everything else that was coming through for so long that I can see why he grasped onto this hope, because he was looking for any weapon he could to save his people.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see it's not just a weapon of greed that was driving him. It was grasping for any straw he could that he could take home and he could present to his father and say, we can stop having people die. I can take care of my brother. I can take care of whoever else he had in his life, because we never get to see that. We don't know if he had a sweetheart that was waiting for him that he wanted to have a family with. We don't know any of that, because all we know is Boromir, captain of the guard, who needed the ring because he wanted to free people. He wanted the right things. So his is a tragic tale because it was a desire to do good.
That's true.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else ever wonder? I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jesse.
I was just going to say that's another wonderful thing that Lord of the Rings does, is that it draws subtle but clear differences between right and wrong, the examples of strength, the examples of wisdom. I like to joke around that Sauron's kind of a goofball because of some of the mistakes and things that are made. But it's a clear, the fog of war, and these clear, terrible choices that have to be made by both the good and the bad sides of this. It's a wonderfully complex tale that doesn't have the same kind of deep emotional writing on the surface that a lot of people do now in modern age, where we discuss and deeply dive into them. But if you can fill in that gap just a little bit personally and understand people's positions, it's very brilliant.
Well, I mean, you got to remember, the stiff upper lip is the British way, right? Or at least it was. And so he was writing for his contemporaries. He was writing to gift the British people that, a renewed legend and lore to, rival Beowulf, right? And so, of course, he kind of leaned into the stoicism. But, if you've ever met people that are stoic, that doesn't mean they have no emotions just because they don't show their emotions.
Well, and there's a huge study on the effect of grief on people and the different ways that people deal with grief, where you have Denethor, who completely loses his marbles. You have Theoden, who the grief over losing his son is part of what pushes him to eventually rise up. To say, I have this deep grief, but yet there's still so many other things and so many other people that need me. And you see, as people lose things, how they deal with them. And that goes back to the experiences from the war. Because, like I say, almost everybody knew a soldier, but a lot more of them knew ones that were not coming home. And so he brought that grief in and said, this is what you can make from your grief.
Yeah. Go ahead.
There is some interesting graphs of demographics. So one of my majors when I was in college was sociology, and they do it's a pyramid of growth of population that kind of ebbs and flows. If you look at it from a timeline perspective, what you can distinctly tell the war era of World War I, because there's just huge chunks where it's just back down to zero. I mean, literally a whole generation of young men died, and some women, obviously, because there were female nurses back then, and drivers, as we learned with Queen Elizabeth. But there was like you said, it was easier to meet someone who, didn't know. So it was more rare to meet someone who wasn't tied to loss during the First World War. And because of the way the British enlistment system is, they drew their units locally. It wasn't just, few people here, a few people there. Whole towns died.
Yeah.
Because that unit recruited from this one area. And that's one of the things they started changing after this because of that effect. But when this regiment got hit hard, it wasn't just the tragedy of the young men dying in the prime of their life. It was the tragedy to the village they left behind. Yeah. And you see some of that with the stakes he creates for the war against the orcs and the vast evil that they're fighting. Go ahead, Posthumus. You were going to say?
Actually kind of dovetails with what Jesse was saying. I always wondered, does anyone else ever get the impression that Boromir's fall was also a great comparison piece for what made Aragorn different from the rest of most of the other people? And, the way he handles things different than Theoden and all the other people around him. But Boromir especially, if you look at what happened with Boromir, how he handled things versus Aragorn, and Aragorn is the actual king, the heir apparent to that, whereas Boromir is simply somebody who has kind of been put into it. He's got a family stake in it and everything, but he's not the royal blood. He's not the one that's supposed to reform the sword and do the charge. Aragorn is, and for me, Boromir's fall and pretty much all the other major powerful men characters in that all kind of have to be compared against Aragorn to show what it takes to be the leader of men, humans, but
yeah. Well, and I think that it leads right into Denethor as a real piece of work, but basically someone who'd been corrupted by not just by the Palantir, but by the fact that he was never going to be king. He was a warden. He was in charge. He had all the responsibilities, and as far as he knew, there would never be a king. So he kind of took it on himself to act in that role when he was not entitled to, and I think he passed that down to his son because Boromir would do anything to impress his father.
Yep.
And so I think your point is very good that there's a difference between Denethor, Boromir as the wardens, and Aragorn as the rightful king. That there is maybe a level of responsibility. And I've never actually thought about it in this way, so I'm still working my way through it. But the idea that the idea that Denethor, as warden, taking on the responsibilities of a king, is corrupting himself, that he did not have the right to do what he did, and the Palantir is just a cover for that. It's a smokescreen. You know, we look at that and we say, "Oh yeah, that's what it is." But I think it goes further back than that.
All right. Would you also say that it might be that he couldn't handle it, but Aragorn could?
I think so.
No,
I think, well, you know, if he's talking about the divine right of kings, maybe, which I'm not sure he is, but that's, oh, hello, sweet kitty. My kitties are around here somewhere. That's adorable. But yeah, I think there's a possibility that he's saying, yeah, that Denethor couldn't handle it, and it was because he didn't have the right. That there was something about Aragorn, not just in the choices he made, but who he was, that made him the rightful king. And I think it could go both ways. I think you could say that he had what it took, but then he made the choices that made that come to life, that made that real. That if Aragorn had gone through his whole life just sort of coasting on the fact that he knew he was the rightful king, he wouldn't have been the rightful king.
Yeah.
Well, and I would argue, we were talking about kind of mirrors a moment ago. That a big theme is how fathers affect their sons, and the choices of fathers and how they affect their sons. And I would argue that Denethor's insecurities are not, they're not just a noticeable difference between Aragorn and Boromir. I would argue they are the difference, that without having to grow up in the shadow of his father's insecurity, Boromir wouldn't be that guy. It would not have ended that way for him. The same way that Theoden's mistakes end up falling upon his sons. The difference, of course, that we see between the two fathers is how Theoden handles the loss, and how God, I have such a hard time with his name. How Denethor handles his issues. So that's another. I think all those things are on purpose, and they are the defining difference between those two characters, with Aragorn and Boromir.
Yeah. And I think I kind of agree more with Jesse. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Aragorn was far older than Boromir, had experienced far more things in the realm of loss and hardship and just having to survive various situations that Boromir just didn't have. Boromir knew war, and he knew loss associated with that, but he didn't quite have that same depth of understanding that Aragorn did. And I think he only just started getting that at the end of Fellowship, just that taste of it.
Yeah, and we don't know anything about Aragorn's parents, really. I mean, what relationship he had with his father. That would be fascinating to me to know, where did this come from? Was this all just Aragorn because he was super cool, or did he have a parental figure that made a difference? You know, if we're talking Denethor and, you know, influencing Boromir, who influenced Aragorn?
Didn't Elrond influence Aragorn to a certain extent?
He was
or
a
am I
teacher,
misremembering?
yes.
Yeah,
they knew each. Yeah, and well, that's how Aragorn gets to know Arwen, is by being in Elrond's. So yeah, I guess you could look at Elrond as being a father,
at least
figure.
a mentor figure,
and a mentor. Yeah, and you know, he'd be a good influence. Yeah. So anyway,
coping mechanisms. Coping mechanisms are
old Toby.
If anyone ever learns anything from me watching this, by God, work on your coping mechanisms and make sure they are healthy.
So, before we dive into the next question I have, one of the things, I was just doing some reading off to the side because I'm going to have to dig back into some of his biographies. I just found out a little nugget. Apparently, because the War Office censored the letters that the troops were sending home, he actually created his own dot-based code to write to his wife to tell her where he was to get around the censors, which makes sense now when you know why he was a code breaker during World War II.
Yeah. He broke their systems, so why not help break the others?
Right, and it also makes sense now that he made his own language, because he was already doing that to outsmart the government, to outsmart the man. So one of the things that we have when it comes to the lore of elves and dwarves and all that, like obviously those concepts existed predating Tolkien, but parsing that out, like if you look at someone now and you ask them what they know of dwarves and elves, etc., one of the things you're going to realize is they're going to have a hard time distinguishing what was written by Tolkien and later used by Gygax and D&D and what existed outside of that. It'd be interesting to find someone who dove into where the state of those kinds of concepts were before Tolkien became Tolkien, right? Because like I imagine their understanding might be a little different than what we know today. Have you guys done any consideration on that?
Jen has actually. She's always been fascinated with all kinds of lore. So when she and I met, and I brought her into the realm of Tolkien, she actually was very well versed in the older versions of elves and dwarves and all kinds of critters. So when she and I would sit down, and she would help me build dungeon adventures, for people on D&D, and she'd be looking through the monster manual and going, "Oh, that's this, and that's that kind of critter, and that must be based on this." And it's like, not wrong at all. You really know this stuff. And she had like a volume. She would read volumes and volumes. Anything she could find that had elves of any kind of lore, she would just devour it when she was a kid. So that's something you could ask her sometime.
We'll have to do that. So that was a picture I just threw up on the screen, if you're actually watching and not just listening, of Tolkien in his World War I uniform. And then this was one of the Fusilier battalions he was in charge of prepping for the Somme, which is their kind of claim to fame. But yeah, there's a lot of rich history in there, and I can definitely see how all of that influenced. So that is what made me curious to see the state of understanding of like mythology before he put his footprint on it.
Well, I can tell you that he really did create the spelling of dwarves that we use today, or at least popularized it. I thought that was a myth. Okay, I saw it in a meme somewhere. I thought somebody's making this crap up. This is not true. But then I was reading earlier works, and they refer to them as dwarfs with a F. And it wasn't until Tolkien that we started going, you know what? We're going to call them dwarves. And so I think we owe him a debt of gratitude, because dwarfs just looks dumb.
Wait a minute. Before we do that, let's stop the presses. Are you telling me that when it's on a meme, that doesn't automatically mean it's true?
I'm sorry to break your heart there, J.R., but yes, that is what I'm saying.
I hope you're sitting down.
Destroyed my childhood.
Yeah.
She's like that. She's just mean.
Yeah, that's terrible.
Obviously, he changed the spelling, and I'd heard that too. Didn't he make an impact on the way we handled elves too in literature, as far as like some of the spelling and stuff?
Well, yeah, elves is the same way, actually.
Right. Okay. That's what I thought.
It's that same change in etymology, but the elves that people knew about back in the day were all more what we would call fairy today. Yep. Most of them were small creatures. Many of them were creatures that didn't resemble anything we recognize. But
no, actually, the original ideas of elves were more akin to gremlins than they were used to.
Right. And
think of the shoemaker and his elves. That's a much older story.
Yeah.
And
that's what I was just going to say in that story. Well, I was going to say in that story, they're dwarfs, which is possibly where I saw that, in fact, because that was pretty recently that I was looking at that story. But yeah, they were gremlins. They were dwarfs. They were boggarts. They were, all these little grunty, wrinkly creatures. And then Tolkien came up with these tall, ethereal, wonderful critters that everybody wanted to be because they were beautiful and they lived forever. Yeah. And that was a huge change.
And I think that's maybe one of Tolkien's gifts to the world, is that our mythos and things like that, they don't have a standardization. They have an enmeshment, for lack of a better term. So what is elf? Well, is elf Alf from Alfheim, from the light elves and the dark elves of Norse mythos, and Svartalheim, the dwarves. But there's Celtic notions of all these things as well, which in some ways draws, in some ways doesn't. So there's this crazy mismatch of everybody's different tribes and clans that have all these different stories, And Tolkien comes in, and at least for the modern age, gives us a standardization for things like D&D and everything moving forward of this image of them that everybody knows and can work off of that makes things that are familiar. And you can take that and run with it as much creativity as you like, and still go back to the old ways when you want to. But my 8-year-old recognizes dwarfs and elves just off the rip because it's already in everything else already. And he knows those stories almost before he reads them at this point.
So,
and it's great. But
one of the things that, and this isn't, this is something I knew because we studied it in history classes. But one of the things that that Tolkien did in his academic writing was he studied the etymology of words. He focused specifically on like Old German, but a lot of the Old German is drawing from the Slavic, from the Viking, from the Norwegian, from the interplay of all those cultures, because they were all meeting and clashing at that era when these words would have been sort of codifying the meaning. And then he would have been aware that the spelling issue, there was no Webster yet. Like Webster hadn't decided to make her dictionary, which meant it's however phonetically it sounded to the monk writing it in an era when most people weren't literate. So he was having to deal with that too. So it makes sense to me that he would want to standardize that, if for no other reason, just to serve his own interest as an academic.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it sounds like we've already given ourselves like 20 extra particular spin-off topics.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
On all of this. Both his personal
This is rich.
Only 20?
I'm just,
slacking off.
I run out of fingers and toes at 20, so it's.
Fair enough.
So that's one of the things we wanted you to join the conversation, dear listener at home, dear reader. And so, like, you could tell us in the comments where you first found this franchise. If you have a favorite character, favorite scene, favorite book, because I think all of that matters. Your thoughts on all of it is important. And as we wrap this up, I think a lot of people in our era were exposed to Tolkien through the movies, through the books, or not through the books, but through the movies and the cartoons. So what did you guys think of the translation to the early 2000 movies of Lord of the Rings?
I loved them.
I will say,
okay. Okay, so here's the thing. I don't have a memory of when I first read The Lord of the Rings, okay? But I was young enough that what I got out of it was the fun and adventure. And you can read this series, you can read these books any way you like. You can read them as metaphor, you can read them as social commentary, you can read them, and that's one of the reasons that they're so rich and powerful. But for me, the movies captured that early enjoyment. So I didn't mind when they took a little deviation from what was actually on the text, because that's what movies do. They have to adapt. But
each story is confined by the medium in which you share it. So you can do things in text that you can't do on a screen. Like you can't show the inner thoughts of the main character or the characters, right? It's harder to do.
Right.
So it makes sense that there going to be differences when you translate that across, be it from book to movie to graphic novel, whatever the case may be.
But I thought they did a great job casting. I loved the visuals. It was, like I said, it took me back to my childhood, so I was willing to forgive it a lot.
I think the one unfortunate part about the movies for the Lord of the Rings was they set the bar so high on costuming that when I watched the Rings of Power that Netflix butchered, when I watched some of the other fantasy, I'm like, ooh, I know what good costuming looks like, and this ain't it.
It was Prime, it wasn't Netflix.
It wasn't Netflix, but
it's Amazon Prime. Yeah,
the Lord of the Rings, just as a movie itself, outside of the Tolkien property, like it set the bar so high for fantasy costuming that it's really hard for some of the more cheesy stuff that like was popular in the 80s and the 90s. Like that's just not good enough anymore.
Some of it wasn't good enough to begin with, but now it's really bad.
Well, I mean, some of it's technology changing and the ability to do certain things, but
you need to have a long talk about a film called Hawk the Slayer, and then we'll have the discussion about what's good.
Hawk the Slayer.
That is on our season 5 list of movies we want to review. Beastmaster, Conan.
I can't be a part of that. I will riff the living hell out of that thing. I cannot watch it and not shred it. So
it's fantastic
we'll
for
have a great
that.
time,
It is.
Fun.
It's
but somewhere
fantastic
in the
for
back
shredding.
there's screaming things at the screen, I assure you.
Oh, that's why you watch it with riff tracks, because it is amazing with riff tracks.
I
It's
actually
so good.
I actually riffed that film when I was 12.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like what is it?
And
Mystery
I
Science
can't
Theater.
watch the riff tracks version because I'm like, you missed this. You missed this.
You
let
got
that
all.
slip?
Well, if you've
Come on,
already
guys,
done
you're
it,
slipping on me
yeah.
We need to get our version of like the Mystery Science Theater 3000 where they just mock
That's
it.
it.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
what riff tracks
That'd be
is.
fun.
Let me talk to you about riff tracks afterward.
Okay.
I'll tell you.
So Terry,
I'll
what
tell
did
you
you
about
think of the movies?
I thought the Lord of the Rings movies were quite well done. Like I said, most of my experience and going back to Tolkien again and again was the BBC radio production, which was full cast, well done, all the things. Now, if you're going to talk about the Hobbit movies, that is a completely different conversation. If you're going to talk about more than first movie, you're going to need to get me a soapbox. But Lord of the Rings, that was fine.
Okay. What about you, Jana?
Yeah, I have to agree with Terry. I really loved the Lord of the Rings treatment. I like the extended editions the best because they were able to keep in some of those things that I know why they cut them for the theatrical time, because I'm a mother and the bladder stops when you have to run out of the theater because you just can't take it anymore. If they had added those extra hours in there, it would have been really problematic. So extended edition on my home screen where I can have my own snacks and I can come and go as I need to. That's all lovely. The Hobbit I had a problem with because it was never meant to be a 3-part series like that. You took something that was a really tightly told story and then dragged it out and added things to it that were completely and utterly unnecessary. And my daughter, so we read both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to my daughter, who is almost 12. And she tried really, really hard to watch The Hobbit, and she got bored because she's like, this part wasn't in the book, and who's that, and why do they care, and why is Thorin acting this way? This is not the way the book was. And she has a point in this case that the movie was not done better than the books. It was expanded so much in ways that I didn't like, that one loses a lot of the charm of those three, where you had the stories well told. They were so well acted. The casting choices made a huge difference. I can't imagine, Aragorn being anybody but Viggo Mortensen at this point. Gandalf with Ian McKellen, Christopher Lee. I mean, these big names that stepped in to fulfill these roles in such a dramatic way. It was amazing, but The Hobbit did not have that same thing. And I wish that was different, because I wanted a Hobbit that matched The Lord of the Rings, but was this tight, well-told tale that we had in the first place.
I'm gonna be the outlier. I like the Hobbit movie because I like that battle with the elves versus the dwarves and with the dragon. Like I ate that shit up. I liked it. It did drag in certain places.
Cool movie.
There were certain places where it certainly dragged, but I mean, I overall, compared to the direct we get nowadays, like I still liked it. So, what about you, Terry? Excuse me, Terry. What about you, Jesse? You haven't weighed in on this one.
So the thing for me, and I think Jana kind of, again, as she often does, hits the nail on the head. If you go to take somebody's story, and forgive me, I'm trying not to sneeze. If you go to take someone's story and expand it or alter it, you have to have the grasp of the characters. You have to know how they think, how they breathe, how they feel, and make changes there. Like, I'm a big Altered Carbon fan, at least the first novel. And Netflix takes Altered Carbon and they change things, but who Takeshi does not change. And in the movie version of Lord of the Rings, we are gifted with Boromir's death. I would have followed you, my brother, my captain, my king. And it's one of the few changes that I actually feel is superior in a way to the death in the book, where they kind of just sing Boromir's death and honor him one last time. But Boromir doesn't get to show that same level of recognition of who Aragorn is or anything like that. Theoden's speech, ride to ruin and the world's ending. It is just one of these moments that perfectly encapsulates this character that was never said in the original source material. And I love that. I love that they were able to do that. Would I have loved to see the Scouring of the Shire? Absolutely. Would I have loved to have Tom Bombadil worked in here in some way, just to have a fun, wacky character that pops up? Absolutely. Tom Bombadil's an absolute nut job. It's fantastic. He's super fun. So, like, do I want all these other things in here? Yes. But if you're going to take it and make the movie, this is the treatment that you need to give it. And I believe that treatment was as well done as could be expected.
Okay. And finally, Mr. Posthumus.
Good thing you saved me for last. Everybody
Get the
buckle up.
popcorn.
Okay.
Okay,
Now,
we have to wrap soon, so.
Yes, I get that.
Okay.
As
Okay.
usual, I can talk way too much, but I'll try to make this concise. All right. As a fan, as a writer, and as someone who worked on pretty much any aspect of filmmaking aside from anything to do with makeup or special effects, all right, I feel like The Fellowship of the Ring is as close to perfection as you get on all levels. It was the closest to an adaptation. You felt the characters that came from that. And Jesse's point about Boromir, absolutely, because it also gives Boromir more depth. You know, there's a little bit of shallowness to his character if you're just reading through, or if you don't get those extra pieces, that really helped add to it. But from the fan point of view, you get to the Two Towers, I have a whole long list of you could do a panel on what I disagree with and what makes me unhappy, because there are a lot of changes that were made specifically for fandom and not the fandom that made that book popular enough for somebody to buy up the rights and spend millions of dollars to make it happen. And I also think they took some valid story points out of Two Towers. And for that, no. From a movie point of view, fantastic. From a completely no Tolkien whatsoever before, just raw going in, I think all three movies did a fantastic job. And I feel like Return of the King is kind of a half and half. They got a lot of stuff like they did right in Fellowship, and they got a lot of the things they did, what the hell was that, in Two Towers. But as a whole, I think from a movie perspective, fantastic. From a writer point of view, I can see where a lot of their decisions were made. From a fan point of view, from a reader point of view, that's why a lot of writers don't want other people working on their IPs. Because some of those decisions, you talk about how the character doesn't change in that series. What happens when it does? You alienate the people who made that property worth somebody's attention to try to make money off of. And you could either say that's a good thing or a bad thing. From a fan point of view, I find it to be a bad thing. From a writer point of view, I think it's an unfortunate thing. And I don't, even after working in film, see where it's a necessary thing in the industry. I think it's a weakness of theirs. As far as The Hobbit goes, dude, they could have made a good 3.5-hour movie, broken it up into two if they felt like it was too much of a popcorn situation, and the bathroom breaks, totally there with you on that. And I'm sorry, there's only so much, you can only eat so much popcorn before it's just too much. I really feel like they dropped the ball by just stretching it out too far and adding too much. They went too much Two Towers, from my personal view, on The Hobbit. There are many great things, fantastic performances. Sorry, Benedict Cumberbatch as Smaug? Yes. The casting, even the characters that weren't canon from the books, I think the casting on both series was wonderful, inspiring. Same with the effects, the costuming, on just a production level. Incredible, incredible work. But again, it's where I stick on is it ain't the source material. If you're going to give me something besides the source material, give me something better. or something equivalent. Don't give me something to pacify some other business.
All right. And with that, we're going to bring this puppy to a close. If you've got other things you want us to cover about the wild world of Tolkien, hit us up and we'll do more episodes. Maybe even get the same guests back. Melissa, what are you writing at the moment? And then how can listeners and viewers at home find you?
I'm still working on War Master, working along. The last book turned into 2 books. This series will never end. So yeah, I'm working on War Master, which is great, and seeing the end of that, and we'll see what I move on to afterward. You can
War Hamster.
War Hamster. Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna write the sequel series, which is the War Hamster series.
War Hamster. Yeah, that's what comes after.
The War Hamster and his trusty sidekick J.R.R. And you can find me on Facebook. You can find me on X, Twitter. I'm review books on Goodreads just for fun. And my website is melissamcshanewrites.com.
So this is like one of those situations, you see that meme where you've got the squirrel and it's like, you saved my life, now I owe you a debt kind of thing. Yeah. You could do that with a hamster too.
That's totally right.
All right. Teri, I know you're dying to make those hamster noises, but I'm going to ask you to hold it in just a little bit longer so we can wrap this up. And what are you writing and recording? And then how can we find you on the internet?
So right now I am trying to not use the cat of nine tails on the 3rd book in my series, which I'm trying to get done by the end of the year. As for narration, I have 2 projects I'm working on, including one of Posthumus over there. And I'm usually on the Facebook, Teri K. Jobe, and just kind of randomly there in the ether.
All right, Jana, what are you writing at the moment? Keep in mind, dear listeners, we're recording this the first week of January and storing these episodes so we can take the holiday season off, because I'm told that the returning guests would mutiny if I expected them to record on Christmas. So, they've got this little thing like family and standards. I don't know what that's about, but, whatever.
Yeah, we make standing rib roasts for Christmas and eat ourselves into a coma.
Very good.
That would not be a thing because yum. So I'm working on an urban fantasy series, the Sentence of Essence. I'm trying to get some of those books knocked out, and we'll see how far they are by the time that this airs, because it's been up and down. And let's see, what else am I doing? I'm kicking out a couple of short stories, hopefully one that'll go out for Christmas time as a just give me to my newsletter followers, because those are always really, really fun about gargoyles in New York City. So that will be a good thing. And then we'll see what comes up next. I have lots of ideas. It's just which one gets to take priority in the little jumble that is my brain. And I can be found on opalkingdompress.com or on Amazon, Facebook, all the other places under Jena Rey or under Jana S Brown or under other things that are all romantic and squishy. And we're not talking about those today.
Ew, emotions, yuck. All right.
There's kissing. Ew. Get a room.
Jess, and that's why you fade to black. So we don't have to see them get a room. Jesse, what are you writing at the moment, and then how can we stalk you on the internet?
I'm working on way too much. I'm working on a space trucker story for an upcoming mini antho. It's going to be pretty cool. It's going to be a jumble of Jesse's. Everyone involved in the production, editing, cover, writing, all of it. We're all different Jessies. So we'll have that out at some point. Well, reverse Highlander. We're trying to collect as many as possible instead of get rid of everybody. I am working on Gravesinger, which is probably going to be my first full-length novel. It's also the first novel in my Holy Diver in the Midnight Sea universe, which is meant to be genreless. It's meant to take all the different genres, all the cool characters and concepts, and smack them into one cool place on the edge of an interdimensional sea, basically a bar where all their fixers are. So I'll be working on that. And I'm sure y'all will see me in some upcoming anthos and things that are coming out either through Three Ravens, Bayonet Books, or anything like that. You can find me at outlawauthor.com. That's where all my stuff is going to be in one place. You'll get teasers from my stories, a list of all the things I'm working on, cool artwork, You can find me on X at Jesse James Books, and you can find me on Instagram or Facebook at Jesse James Fain. Facebook's a personal page. As I warn everybody, that's going to be guns, tattoos, heavy metal. It's going to have all my writing stuff too, but that's me sharing my personal thoughts. If you're not into that, don't show up. Yeah, that's me.
Heavy metal is an interesting conversation. I remember when Pearl Jam and Guns N' Roses were considered heavy metal, and now they play them on light rock stations.
Well, they're classic
I know.
rock.
Yep.
It's
They're
sad.
grocery store music.
I heard it in the elevator, my Michelle, and I'm like, "Ooh, no, it's not time for that yet. Give me back my Axel." All right, and we're going to be listening to this is episode 501, so you'll have just heard our great 500th episode little shindig that we're doing right before this, and Jesse should be having a couple launching because we just heard back, like I said, we're recording this at the beginning of December from Three Ravens, and a lot of those anthologies are going to start dropping, so you're going to go from like 0 to like a bazillion anthology books out there in a minute.
Woo.
So all right, Jenny, I know you let your husband stand in and answer all the cool questions about Tolkien, but since he was here as you, what are you writing at the moment? Because I know you guys collaborate, and then how can they find you guys on the internet?
Still working on that writing thing. I actually got back into writing today. I'm working on, I know, right? Over a year. Shocking. But it wasn't a lot, but I have done some. I think I got like 1,000 words in today, so yay.
Good.
Better than 0.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually part of the sci-fi universe. I'm trying to finish the novel I started like before June happened. Oh, hi, sweetheart.
Oh, sweet kitty.
And I'm working on putting together the universe Bible. Teri, the wonderful Teri over there. Weird fingers that up in the other.
Yeah, I know. I was like, what?
Somewhere, yeah. We'll just go. Somewhere
That's
here. Yes, that way. That way.
All right. And
anyways, she's doing the audio for Hidden Motives. So, and I have a Kickstarter coming out in springish for the sci-fi universe. So there will be 5 novels in that Kickstarter that should be up for grabs.
Great.
So that's what I'm doing. Oh, and of course covers for Three Ravens, because covers.
And then as far as what I'm writing, I realized just because, and we talked about this, I was writing something with James when he passed. It is relied so heavily on his intimate knowledge of the subject matter that I would not have picked it for myself were I to pick a series. So I'm finding that I'm slowing down a lot to constantly research things about all things Egyptian. And that's very frustrating when I know I could do a lot more words than I'm doing right now. And so the series that I was co-writing with Jana, the reboot series, which is Lit RPG, we have decided I'm going to, once I hit my 1,000 words in the James one, and I need to actually be able to crank words out so I feel like I'm doing something just for my own mental health, we are starting that series. And she is actually, after we record this episode, she is making maps. So she's going to be my little Dora the Explorer over there, and she's going to give me the map. And with that, you can find us.
Backpack.
I carried one of those for many, many years. I watched Bolts with Matilda. I'm done. I'll get a fanny pack or something. And so you can find us on our link tree at linktr.ee linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things, the BitChutes, the Rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, the Twitters. We have the Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page. We have our email, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com for professional purposes only. Save the shenanigans from Adam Stabby Stab over there on the Instagram, Twitter, and the email. We also have our website linked to the link tree. It's a bunch of gobbledygook. Don't hate us, but you can follow us over there and get updated to your email when the audio-only version comes out. You can support the show over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink that coffee brand coffee till they float away on a river of Java goodness. And as I like to say, these episodes aren't free to produce. As we're recording this in December, I am looking for a replacement for StreamYards because it went from $100 a year to $500, and who's got time for that? So there are expenses. So if you decide to contribute, it greatly appreciate you keeping the lights on. And with that, I'd like to thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy co-host, I am J.R.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. And right before I hit that in button, I just realized I didn't tell you. The link is in the show notes. The code is Podcast Grunt. That's how you get that 10% off. We get a little bit of kickback for that coffee brand coffee. And with that, ladies, gentlemen, thank you for coming on. Jenny, thank your husband for gracing us with his many opinions. And with that, we're going to hit that end record button. So, Jesse, don't cuss yet. Wait for it. Man, see, this is the time where it just keeps going. I have hit the end recording button. And it is